Hearing is called to order. Good afternoon. We'll ask for the senator from Colorado to stop being unruly. Welcome to our witnesses. Welcome, everyone. The International Space Station is the largest and most complex habitable space-based research facility ever constructed by humanity. It's a marvel of engineering, and it's critically important to our national space program. For over 17 years, the ISS has provided the United States with continuous access to low Earth orbit, which has been paramount to the success of NASA, our commercial partners, scientific research, and to human space exploration. It's due to the significance of the ISS as a key component of our national space program that this subcommittee led the effort that extended the operation of ISS to 2024 by enacting the Bipartisan U.S. Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act in 2015, which Senator Nelson and I worked on hand in hand, and which was signed into law by President Obama. We then followed up on that effort by once again working in a bipartisan manner, me working closely once again with Senator Nelson, in enacting the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017, which was signed into law by President Trump and established the ISS transition principles. The purpose of the ISS transition principles was to create a stepwise approach to eventually transition from the ISS once there is the emergence of a proven and reliable commercial alternative. Congress decided to take a stepwise approach due to the long history at NASA in which major programs like Constellation and the Space Shuttle had been eliminated prematurely. These decisions have long-term repercussions at NASA. Its workforce, the local communities surrounding NASA centers, and American taxpayers who face increased replacement costs for lost capabilities. Not only was it concerning when NASA failed to deliver the ISS transition report to Congress before December 1st, 2017, as required by federal law, but it was deeply troubling when reports leaked that some were pushing a proposal to end all federal funding of ISS but in 2025. Congress was explicitly clear in making its long-term interest in ISS known in the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017. Federal statute required the transition plan to include cost estimates for extending operation of the ISS to 2024, to 2028, and to 2030. It also required an evaluation of the feasible and preferred service life of the ISS through at least 2028 as a unique scientific, commercial, and space exploration-related facility. Nowhere in federal statute is there a request from Congress seeking a hard deadline to end federal support for ISS, to cross our fingers and hope for the best. We've seen that act play out too many times in our national space program, and it's time we learn the lessons of history. Prematurely canceling a program for political reasons costs jobs and wastes billions of dollars. We cannot afford to continue to pursue policies that have consequences of creating gaps in capability, that send $3.5 billion in taxpayer money to the Russian government, or that create a leadership vacuum in low Earth orbit that provides a window of opportunity for the Chinese to capitalize upon. Let me be clear. As long as I am chairman of this subcommittee, the ISS will continue to have strong support, strong bipartisan support in the United States Congress. And as long as Article 1 of the Constitution remains intact, it will be Congress that is the final arbiter of how long ISS receives federal funding. I'd now like to recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Senator Nelson. Thank you, Senator Nelson. You know, I would note there are issues on which Senator Nelson and I disagree, but on this issue, the importance of the ISS and a resolved commitment to not wasting the billions of dollars we have invested in that asset, Senator Nelson and I are on exactly the same page. Thank you, Mr. Martin. Thank you, gentlemen, both for your testimony. Mr. Gerstenmaier, where did the 2025 date to end federal support for the ISS that's cited in both the ISS transition report and also the President's budget request, where did that date originate?
It originated in the administration.
Did it originate in OMB?
I don't know specifically where it came from, but it came from the administration and discussions about picking a date collectively.
So the date did not come from NASA?
We didn't pick a particular date. We talked about criteria, as you've seen in the transition report and other things. We didn't see the necessity of picking a specific date within the agency, but as part of the administration, we came to the conclusion that picking a date would prompt a serious discussion.
The NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017, as you know, required NASA to submit the ISS transition report to Congress not later than December 1st, 2017. NASA was 3 months late in submitting that report, which was in direct contradiction to federal law. How many drafts of the ISS transition report were prepared before the final report was submitted to Congress on March 30th, 2018?
I don't have a specific number, but we go through a pretty iterative process of putting the report together with lots of comments from a variety of folks, so there was numerous iterations of the report placed together. I think part of the reason was the complexity of the report. If you look at the requirement language in the bill, there was a lot of information required, and we did our best to pull together all that data, and frankly, we missed the December date on our own just because we couldn't get the information put together and written down in time to make that December date.
Is it correct that NASA sent at least 2 drafts to the administration, both of which were rejected?
I don't know. I'd have to go check on the specific number. I would say they've never been rejected. They get sent over. We get comments back. We iterate back and forth on the comments, and that occurred after the December deadline. It occurred this year.
On February 20th, 2018, Senator Nelson and I together sent a letter to NASA requesting, quote, all preliminary versions of the ISS transition report as described in Public Law 115.10, including any drafts of the report that have been delivered to OMB or the National Space Council for review. To date, that request has not been complied with. Does NASA intend to comply with that request?
Let me take that question for the record, and we'll deliberate and see.
To your knowledge, is someone in the administration specifically blocking NASA from providing those documents?
There's no specific blockage. I think we just need to discuss amongst ourselves what the benefit is and what's in those versions of the documents and see if they're helpful or not in the discussion moving forward. Many of the comments will reflect what actual debates within NASA itself, where we had lots of discussions back and forth about what should be in the document, what shouldn't be in the document, et cetera. Some of those things we consider somewhat pre-decisional, where we'd like to have that free debate within the agency. We think it's important for us to have open dialogue within the agency where we can disagree with each other and not be subject to external review. So for some of those reasons, we'd like to hold some of those back, but I'd like to meet with our teams and the legal folks, and we'll get together and determine what the right approach is.
Well, and let me be clear, we're not asking for internal documents within NASA. We're asking for any drafts that were submitted to OMB. So presumably once a draft was submitted to OMB, NASA had resolved the internal questions and was submitting something for approval. And it is my concern that considerations other than the merits of the science drove this decision-making process. And so the letter from Senator Nelson and me was not a request for NASA to assess how helpful it might be or not to have those drafts submitted to OMB turned over to us. It is rather for Congress to make that determination. Let me ask a different question on the merits. Mr. Gerstenmaier, as a scientific matter, is the ISS capable of operating beyond 2025?
Yes.
How long do you believe we can safely operate the ISS?
We've done a look at the structural integrity and the major components through 2028, and it looks very viable through 2028. The current maintenance on station is fairly low. We just did a spacewalk today to repair some things and move things forward, but that's predicted. I think we have a good operational life at least through 2028 and possibly a little bit further beyond that. We just need to continue to watch station, continue to maintain it. The IG calls out in their report components we need to watch and upgrade and maintain, but the teams are doing a good job of doing that and keeping it in good operational case and capability. What we don't want to have happen is where we're spending more time doing maintenance than we are doing research. And at that point, then the utility of station starts to diminish, and we have not seen that yet. Station is very viable, at least through 2028.
Page 6 of the ISS transition report states, quote, among the benefits beyond the prospect of lower operational costs for an LEO platform, shifting focus to industry can additionally reduce the infrastructure burden on NASA, as has already been demonstrated at NASA facilities at Kennedy Space Center, Johnson Space Center, Stennis Space Center, and Michoud Assembly Facility. If the policy as described in the ISS transition report is carried out, how will the infrastructure of the Johnson Space Center be reduced?
I think what the report is referring to is it's talking about a way we can reduce the infrastructure costs for NASA programs. So in the case of the Michoud Assembly Facility, we were able to bring some commercial companies in that could use the facilities at Michoud in parallel with our operations. So then they would share some of the facility use, some of the utility bills, some of the support personnel. There were multiple users in the facility of which NASA only had to pay now a portion of some of that infrastructure cost. So that's what that report is referring to. And so when we think of space station, if we have multiple users in space where NASA is just one of multiple users, then that cost of infrastructure and say cargo flights or crew flights, those can be shared between the government and the commercial sector, and then that lowers the cost to the government. And that's what's implied by that infrastructure discussion. So it's not a reduction in personnel, it's an efficiency that's gained. And so at the Johnson Space Center, if some commercial companies could come in and do operations in the facility or in the center, where they share some of the overhead of maintenance and lighting and utilities, then that lowers costs for NASA. So that was what the intent of that discussion was in the report.
How would you project that mission control at JSC would be impacted?
Again, we see mission control continuing at JSC as we bring a commercial crew online. Boeing has chosen to operate CST-100 out of the Johnson Space Center. We also see the gateway activity that we do around the moon. That will be operated out of the Johnson Space Center. So I see mission control continuing into the future as we move human presence into the solar system, carrying the traditional role that the Johnson Space Center has carried in the past.
So as I mentioned in my opening statement, NASA hasn't fared well in the past when decisions were made to prematurely end major programs like Constellation and the Space Shuttle. While there were a host of valid reasons for needing to transition away from the Space Shuttle, the reality is the program was phased out before an alternative was established. This decision created a gap in capability for our national space program and has made NASA reliant upon Russia to transport American astronauts to and from the ISS. As you can see from this first chart here, between 2006 and 2018, the price that NASA has paid the Russian government to secure seats to transport American astronauts to and from the ISS has increased from roughly $21 million to over $80 million, a cost increase of 372%, or a $60 million increase in just 12 years. As you can see from this second chart, The consequence of having this gap in capability means that American taxpayers will have sent roughly $567 million to the Russian government to transport our astronauts to and from the ISS, which comes out to roughly $3.5 billion between 2006 and 2018. And it's also worth noting that commercial delivery systems cost will be 2.4 times more than the space shuttle. What do you see as the consequences in terms of capability lost if federal funding is phased out for the ISS in 2025?
Again, I think, you know, we have some principles that we carry within human spaceflight, and one of those principles is the continuity of human spaceflight. And we believe keeping a continuous presence in human spaceflight is important, and continuing to keep a leadership role in spaceflight. And I think Station needs to have that leadership role. What we're describing here with this activity is we think now is the time to do the planning to make sure that we have a good transition from the predominantly government-funded space station we have today to where we have now commercial space stations, other activities in low Earth orbit that we can continue to use to keep our leadership role and to keep human presence in space. So we're thinking more of a transition rather than a stop and then a start. As you've shown through your graphs and the plots here, it's not good when you stop and then you start at some TBD point in space. So what we're trying to do through this activity and through the transition report is establish some principles, which you can read in the report. We're trying to go out to industry, ask industry what the government can do to help them take a better role in low Earth orbit operations, and how we can make an effective transition where the government doesn't have to be the sole payer, and U.S. industry can do new things and inventive ways in space. And we've seen some positive examples of that with both commercial crew and commercial cargo. I think there's some real advantages of the private sector doing some things in innovative and creative ways. I think we can do the same thing in low Earth orbit. We need some time to do that. We would like to begin that activity in earnest now, and then we can see how that works through the period of time and then figure out when the right time is to transition station.
So as you know, China has announced that it intends to have its first permanent manned space station ready for service in 2022. Do you have any concerns that China may be putting itself in a position to fill a leadership vacuum in low Earth orbit if it's the only country with an operational station beyond 2025?
I think we need to be aware of that consideration and factor that into our planning as we go forward.
Okay, final question for Mr. Martin. Both the ISS transition report and the President's budget request list 2025 as the date in which direct federal support of the ISS will end. Has your office looked into where that 2025 date originated, and if not, will you commit to examining that question?
We have not looked into where the 2025, and respectfully, we will not look into it's a policy issue by the administration. Unless there's some evidence of any nefarious outside influence on that decision, it really is a policy decision, much like the previous administration had decided to focus on an asteroid retrieval mission as opposed to a lunar return. And so really the Inspector General's office, we look at, we don't deal with policy, we're not management. We look at programs once they've been decided on by the Congress and the administration, and then we find fault in those programs.
With all due respect, Mr. Martin, it is not a policy decision when it is directly contrary to federal statute that has been enacted into law, the NASA Transition Authorization Act of 2017. And I believe that date directly contradicts statutory language that was passed unanimously by both houses of Congress. Thank you, Senator Nelson. We just heard the defense rests, and I will say my friend Senator Matlock would receive a directed verdict if this were indeed a courtroom.
If you were the judge, I'm sure.
I'm going to ask just a couple of very brief questions, and we're going to wrap this hearing up. Mr. Gerstenmaier, a minute ago you were having a discussion with Senator Nelson about pharmaceutical research. If a billion-dollar drug is created due to the research on the ISS, what claim would NASA have to the intellectual property, and what share, if any, of the revenue would NASA receive?
Again, we can, that's a pretty detailed answer that comes from that, and we can go look at that. We've been trying to look at the advantages of providing, if a company operates with NASA, typically we own the intellectual property rights if they participate and develop something in our facilities. But if they put in the majority of the work, all the innovation comes from their side, all the creativity comes from their side, then they should rightfully have ownership. So we've been trying to look at ways that we could amend or clarify what our ownership of intellectual property rights are. Typically, we have those rights. We typically don't ever grab those rights from someone that does research, but we own those rights. That's held some people back from doing research on station because there's a significant amount of work that these companies will have to invest to get that revenue. They're going to have to not only make the discovery on station, but then they're going to have to take it through maybe 10 years of federal drug agency trials and to actually get a pharmaceutical that's on the market. So they'll make a significant amount of investment in that it's probably not appropriate for us to go capture some revenue from that because they've earned that through the money they've put in place. So we'll work with that and we'll see how that looks. But I think in general, we would like to have them, if they put the revenue in, put the time in, put the creativity in, that's their intellectual property that they should be able to use.
So does NASA have any agreements in place for sharing revenue that could be utilized to lower ISS costs?
Not in that direct revenue sharing sense, no.
Well, I think that may be ripe for further discussion, and I look forward to working with you on that. Let me just say finally, I want to thank all the good men and women that work at NASA, the incredible scientists, the incredible leaders, astronauts, brave men and women that are leading our country's space program. We are grateful for your service. As chairman of this committee, I view it as a responsibility that I take very seriously to stand up and fight for you. And I know Senator Nelson views that responsibility with the same gravity. And so I thank you both for your testimony. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record. And upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.